The sector died quietly. No transmission, no distress beacon, no final plea across the quantum bands that connected every corner of charted space to Oa. The Green Lantern outpost simply ceased to exist between one monitoring sweep and the next. The ring assigned to that sector returned to Oa, without its bearer trailing no forensic data, carrying only silence. The Guardians of the Universe gathered in their war chamber, a space that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. They stood in perfect circular formation around a projection of the affected region. The hologram flickered with dead zones, spreading like gangrene through the stellar map. Signal degradation across 7 adjacent sectors, one Guardian reported. The voice carried no inflection, but the words themselves were weighted with implications. 7 sectors, hundreds of inhabited worlds, trillions of lives that might already be gone. Another Guardian gestured, and the projection zoomed inward. The image quality collapsed into static at the boundaries, as if something were actively interfering with their observation. The bleed shows stress fractures. The membrane between universes is compromised. They had seen this before. In the aftermath of the last crisis, reality itself had required stitching back together. The bleed, that space between dimensional walls, had been patched, but never fully healed. Now those old wounds were opening. Hal Jordan received the deployment order while flying a routine patrol near Sector 2814. The message came through his ring with unusual terseness. No briefing, no tactical assessment, just coordinates and a single word: investigate. He changed course immediately, punching through subspace toward the dead zone. John Stewart and Kyle Rayner converged from their own positions, 3 green streaks cutting through the cosmic dark. They didn't speak during the flight. There was nothing to say yet. The transition was sharp. One moment they moved through normal space, where stars burned in their expected positions and physics behaved according to predictable laws. The next moment they crossed an invisible threshold into wrongness. The stars here looked sick. Their light reached the eye but carried no warmth, as if the photons themselves had been drained. Planets hung in orbit like discarded props, surfaces cracked and cooling. Everything felt arrested, mid-destruction, frozen in the instant before total collapse. "Ring analysis," Hal said. The response came fragmented. "Unknown entity, massive energy signature, classification undefined. Warning: conventional containment protocols unlikely to be effective." Kyle pulled up beside him. "That's the most scared I've ever heard a ring sound." "They don't get scared," John said. But his construct was already forming a massive spherical shield that would protect all 3 of them, if needed. They found the outpost where the coordinates indicated, or rather they found where it used to be. The installation had been a small fortress capable of housing 24 lanterns and monitoring a quarter of the sector. Now, it was rubble tumbling through vacuum. The debris field told a story of incredible force, applied from multiple vectors simultaneously. Hal spotted the recording beacon still active, somehow intact amid the wreckage. He retrieved it with a construct hand and activated the playback. The hologram showed the outpost's final moments. Lanterns at their stations, alert levels normal. Then the exterior sensors caught something small drifting toward them through the dark. Pink and white. Vaguely humanoid, but wrong, like a child's drawing of a person rendered in 3 dimensions by someone who didn't quite understand anatomy. The creature moved without propulsion. It simply was where it wasn't before, position changing in discrete jumps that violated every principle of momentum and inertia. One lantern went out to investigate. The recording captured what happened next in perfect detail. The lantern raised a hand in greeting or warning. The creature looked at him. Then the creature smiled. The explosion came from inside the lantern's chest. His body vaporized outward in a sphere of emerald light and organic matter. His ring escaped, shooting back toward Oa at maximum velocity. The creature turned its attention to the outpost itself. It raised one hand almost lazily, and a sphere of pink energy gathered in its palm. The sphere was small, perhaps a meter in diameter. It looked almost gentle as it floated toward the station. When it made contact, the outpost folded inward on itself. Metal screamed. Atmosphere vented in frozen jets. The structure crumpled like paper in a fist, then exploded outward. The creature watched the destruction with what might have been pleasure or might have been nothing at all. The expression was unreadable. The recording ended. The three lanterns hung in space, processing what they'd witnessed. Hal had seen horrors across 100 worlds. He'd fought enemies that could crack planets and beings that fed on fear itself. But this felt different. This felt casual, like watching someone idly kick over an anthill. "That's not from here," Kyle said finally. "No," John agreed. "The energy signature doesn't match anything in the core database. And the way it moved..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. They'd all seen the same thing. The creature didn't fly or teleport. It simply occupied different positions in space without crossing the distance between them. Hal was about to suggest they return to Oa with this data when his ring flared with a proximity alert. All three rings screamed warning simultaneously. Contact. Bearing 072 Mark 15. Distance closing. They turned. The creature floated there, perhaps 100 meters away. This close, they could see it more clearly. Small, maybe the size of a human child. Skin an unnatural pink like raw meat that had never seen sun. White clothing or possibly skin, the distinction unclear. And the eyes. The eyes were wrong. Not evil. Not malicious. Just empty of anything resembling human recognition or purpose. It looked at them the way a curious animal might look at insects. Interested, but not engaged. Present, but not participating in any shared reality. Hal's training took over. "Unknown entity, you are in violation of Green Lantern territorial authority. Identify yourself and state your purpose." The creature tilted its head. The movement was too smooth, as if its neck had no bones. Then it smiled. The smile was worse than any snarl could have been. It reached too wide, revealed too many teeth, and carried absolutely no emotion behind it. Just the mechanical arrangement of a face into something that resembled joy without containing any of its substance. "Constructs now," John said. They didn't need further discussion. 3 separate barriers slammed into existence around the creature. Hal's was a sphere of compressed willpower thick enough to contain a star. John's was geometric, a tesseract of interlocking planes designed to restrict movement in any direction. Kyle's was creative, a maze of light that would confuse and disorient anything trying to navigate through it. For exactly 3 seconds, the constructs held. Then the creature did something. It didn't attack the barriers. It didn't break them down. It simply stopped acknowledging they existed. Its body flattened, became 2-dimensional, slipped through gaps in 3-dimensional space that shouldn't have existed. The constructs collapsed inward on nothing. The creature reformed behind them, whole, unchanged, still smiling. It raised one hand. "Move!" Hal shouted. They scattered in 3 different vectors, emerald contrails painting divergent paths across the void. The sphere of pink energy that erupted from the creature's palm expanded to fill the space they had occupied. Where it passed, space itself seemed to crack hairline fractures appearing in reality like ice under pressure. Kyle was furthest out. He fired back immediately, a barrage of light constructs shaped like missiles. Each one carried enough kinetic force to level a city block. The creature let them hit. The construct splashed against its body like water against stone. The creature's smile never wavered. John tried a different approach. His ring flared bright, and suddenly the creature was encased in a perfect cube of solidified willpower. The walls were nanometers thick, but denser than collapsed matter. Nothing should have been able to move inside that prison. The creature melted. Its body lost cohesion, became liquid, seeped through microscopic gaps that shouldn't have permitted anything larger than individual molecules. The cube remained intact, but empty. The creature reformed 10 meters away, vertical again, solid again, smiling again. It turned toward John. Hal hit it from behind with everything his ring could generate. A beam of pure emerald will focus down to a point sharp enough to pierce dimensional barriers. The kind of attack that could core a moon. It struck the creature dead center and passed through without resistance, as if the target had momentarily stopped existing in the same frame of reference. The creature turned back to Hal. Its head rotated a full 180 degrees while its body remained stationary. Something about that movement, about the wrongness of the articulation, triggered a deeper alarm in Hal's mind than any of the previous violence had. This wasn't a fighter. This wasn't a warrior or invader or conqueror. Those categories implied strategy, purpose, comprehension of conflict as an exchange. This was something else. This was a natural disaster that happened to wear a shape. "Retreat," Hal said. His voice was steady. Years of combat experience kept it that way. "Get back to Oa. They need to see this." "Not leaving you," John said. Wasn't a request. Kyle started to argue, but Hal's ring was already forming a new construct. Not an attack. A massive wall of light between the three lanterns and the creature. Not to contain it, but to obscure line of sight long enough for his teammates to move. The wall lasted 4 seconds. The creature walked through it. Not destroyed it, not breached it, simply occupied the space on the other side as if the barrier were decorative rather than structural. But 4 seconds was enough. John and Kyle were gone, burning hard for the sector boundary. Hal's ring showed their trajectories diverging, making them difficult targets to track simultaneously. That left him alone with it. The creature regarded him with that same empty curiosity. Hal could feel his ring straining against some fundamental wrongness in the creature's presence. The ring operated on willpower, on the absolute conviction that consciousness could impose order on chaos. But this thing seemed to exist outside that framework entirely. It wasn't chaos. Chaos implied randomness, lack of structure. This was something worse. This was purpose without reason. Action without motive. It raised both hands. Hal didn't wait to see what would come next. His ring flared and he was gone, riding a stream of green light back toward the sector boundary at speeds that would have vaporized anything without his protective aura. Behind him, the creature watched him go. It lowered its hands. The smile remained. Then it turned its attention to the nearest planet, a small world that had held 3 billion lives before the sector went silent. The creature drifted toward it with the same casual motion covering light years, in moments without apparent effort. By the time Hal crossed back into monitored space and his ring reconnected with the Oa network, another world had gone silent. And another. The dead zones were spreading. The Guardian Council received his report in that same emotionless state they maintained for all crises. They listened to his description of the encounter. They reviewed the combat footage his ring had captured. They noted the casualties and the rate of expansion. Then one Guardian spoke the words that confirmed Hal's worst fear. "This is not an invasion. This is a breach. Something has fallen through the damaged bleed, and we do not know what laws, if any, govern it." In the war chamber's central projection, the dead zones continued spreading, sector after sector going dark. Not conquered, not occupied, simply erased, their populations and infrastructure reduced to silent debris fields. Somewhere in that expanding darkness, the creature moved through the void. It encountered another Green Lantern patrol. They fought. They died. Their rings returned to Oa. The creature continued on its path, smiling its empty smile, moving through space like a child wandering through a garden, destroying flowers with the same absent interest one might show when kicking stones. The war chamber's alarm systems activated. Priority alert. Multiple sectors reporting simultaneous contact. The thing was not moving in a straight line. It was not targeting specific locations. It was simply existing in places, and those places ceased to exist in its wake. The Guardians looked at their maps and their projections and their calculations. They ran probability matrices and strategic scenarios. Every model returned the same conclusion. If this continued unchecked, the damage would be incalculable. Not extinction level. Worse, existence level. The thing wasn't killing the universe. It was unmaking it bit by bit through simple contact with ordered reality. They needed help. Help that understood stakes beyond a single sector or world. Help that had fought for the survival of everything and understood the price. The message went out on quantum bands marked with every priority flag in the Corps' protocol library. Destination Earth, recipient the Justice League. The text was brief. Reality breach, containment failure, immediate assistance required. Attached to the message was a single image file. The creature frozen mid-smile, drifting through a debris field that used to be a living world. In the watchtower, thousands of light years away, an alarm began to sound. The response came faster than protocols allowed. Within 30 minutes of the distress call reaching OA 12, additional Lantern squadrons converged on the affected region. They came from every corner of known space veterans who had faced world eaters and reality warpers. Lanterns who wore their rings with the absolute conviction that will could impose structure on anything. They were about to learn otherwise. Sector 872 was dying when they arrived. The system's star still burned, but 3 of its planets were already gone. Not destroyed in any conventional sense, simply absent. Where thriving worlds had orbited, now there was only debris too fine to identify dust clouds that sparkled with traces of what used to be cities, forests, oceans. Entire biospheres reduced to cosmic sand. The thing floated near the 4th planet, a gas giant with 17 moons. It seemed to be considering the massive world the way a child might consider which toy to break next. The lanterns formed a perimeter, 20 rings blazing in formation, creating a sphere of emerald light that enclosed the entire region. This wasn't an attack formation. This was containment doctrine refined over millennia. The principle was simple. Establish a barrier so complete that nothing could escape, then systematically reduce the threat within controlled parameters. Salak coordinated from the command ship, his forearms working multiple control interfaces simultaneously. Containment Protocol 7. Multi-layer compression. Do not engage directly until the field is stable. The first barrier went up. A shell of hard light thick enough to block stellar radiation, reinforced with the combined willpower of 20 veteran lanterns. The second layer formed inside it, then a third, then a fourth. Each successive shell tighter than the last, creating a prison that would compress inward until the target could barely move. It looked up at the closing walls. Its expression didn't change. Still that blank regard, still that emptiness behind the eyes. Compression sequence initiated, Salak reported. Estimated time to full containment 40 seconds. The barriers began to contract. The space within shrank from thousands of kilometers to hundreds, then to tens. What they enclosed made no attempt to flee or fight. It simply floated there, allowing itself to be trapped. 30 seconds. The innermost layer was now visible to the naked eye, a glowing sphere perhaps 50 meters in diameter. The target was centered perfectly within it, motionless. 20 seconds. The sphere compressed to 20 meters, then 10. The light intensified as more willpower poured into the structure, reinforcing it against any possible escape attempt. 10 seconds. 5 meters. Their target was completely enclosed now, barely visible through the layers of compressed energy. "Contact in 3, Salak said. 2, 1. The barriers touched its skin. For exactly 1 heartbeat, the structure held. 20 lanterns maintaining perfect synchronization, their rings generating more combined power than most civilizations would produce in a century. The containment was absolute. Nothing could break it from within. Physics itself wouldn't permit it. Then it did something. It didn't push against the barriers. It didn't generate a counterforce. Its body simply lost coherence. Solid became liquid, became something less than liquid, something that existed in the gaps between atomic structures. The entity's mass spread out, seeping through the microscopic spaces between light constructs like water through a sieve. "Breach," 1 lantern reported. Then her voice cut off. Her ring went dark. Not depleted, not destroyed. Just dark, as if something had severed its connection to the power battery on Oa. Her body drifted in the void, lifeless. What had been contained reformed behind the perimeter. Whole again, unchanged, that expression never faltering. It extended 1 palm toward the nearest moon. Salak's voice came sharp across the communication channel. "Scatter formation. Protect the inhabited satellites. Do not let it..." The moon cracked down the middle. Not from external impact. From within, as if something had pulled it apart from its core. The 2 halves drifted slowly apart, their surfaces glowing red, where internal heat met vacuum. Small settlements dotted both fragments. Their lights winked out, 1 by 1. 6 lanterns broke formation to intercept the debris, to save who they could save. The rest maintained position, trying to re-establish containment. But the intruder was already moving. It didn't target the lanterns. That was the worst part. It targeted infrastructure. Supply depots that fed 3 dozen colonies. Communication relays that connected whole sectors. Transit hubs where millions passed through daily. It moved between them, with that same impossible locomotion, appearing and destroying, and moving on, before anyone could react. A lantern named Canon tried to intercept it near a freight station. He was fast one of the Corps' best pursuit specialists. He put himself between the threat and a vessel carrying evacuation ships from a nearby crisis zone. 15,000 refugees, mostly children, fleeing a war 3 sectors over. The entity looked at him. Canon raised a barrier, the kind that could withstand antimatter detonations. What he faced walked through it, not destroyed it. Walked through as if the barrier existed in a different layer of reality. Kayan tried to pull back, too slow. It touched his chest. Kayan's ring flared bright, then went dark. His body convulsed once, then went limp. The ring detached and began its journey back to Oa, leaving its wielder's corpse tumbling through the black. The freight station exploded behind them. Not from a direct hit. The intruder had simply passed through its reactor containment, and the resulting cascade failure vaporized the entire structure. The evacuation ships scattered their crews, desperately trying to jump to FTL before the shockwave reached them. 7 made it. 8 didn't. Hal Jordan arrived with reinforcements to find Sector 872 in chaos. Lanterns were spread across millions of cubic kilometers, trying to perform triage on multiple simultaneous disasters. Rescue operations competed with containment attempts. Every priority system screamed for attention. He found Salak coordinating from a position near the system's edge, his face drawn in a way Hal had never seen before. Salak had witnessed the fall of civilizations. He'd maintained composure through extinction events. But this was different. This wasn't war. War had logic, even if brutal. This was just loss, accumulating faster than they could process it. Status, Hal said. 14 lanterns down, 37 installations destroyed. Current casualty estimate for this sector alone, 4.3 billion. Salak's voice was perfectly steady. Training kept it that way. We cannot stop it. We cannot even slow it. Hal watched the tactical display. The thing was moving through an industrial complex, now a manufacturing hub, that supplied medical equipment to half the quadrant. Just moving through it. Not attacking, not destroying with intent. Simply existing in those spaces, and those spaces ceasing to function wherever it passed. It's not fighting us, Hal said slowly, understanding crystallizing. It doesn't even register us as a threat. We're just obstacles in its path. Then how do we stop an obstacle it doesn't notice? Hal had no answer. The entity continued its wandering path through Sector 872. A lantern named Reese tried to lead it away from a populated moon, flying patterns designed to draw aggression to trigger a chase response. It watched him fly. Then it turned back to the moon and lifted both palms. The moon didn't explode. It simply stopped being. One moment it occupied space, the next moment there was only an expanding cloud of matter so finely dispersed it would take centuries to even register as dust. 3 million colonists, erased, not killed, just ceased. Reese hung in space staring at where the moon used to be. His ring flickered as if even it couldn't quite process what had just happened. The thing moved on to the next target. By the time the Guardians ordered a full withdrawal, they'd lost 19 lanterns. Not lost in the sense of killed in combat, lost in the sense of ceased to exist in proximity to that thing. Their rings returned faithfully to Oa, but the wielders were gone, and the rings carried no data about how or why. The evacuation of Sector 872 began in earnest. Every available ship, every transport that could be spared from surrounding regions. The lanterns, who remained, formed not containment barriers, but evacuation corridors, using their rings to shield civilian vessels as they fled the sector. The creature paid no attention to the evacuation. It wasn't interested in ships or people. It was interested in structure. In the built things, the organized things, the places where sapient life had imposed order on the cosmos. Wherever it went, that order collapsed. Hal Jordan stayed until the end. Not because he could make a difference, Because someone needed to witness. Someone needed to remember exactly how this happened, so the next time they'd know better. He watched it drift through a communications array that had stood for 5,000 years. The array had been a marvel of engineering capable of transmitting signals across dimensional boundaries. The entity passed through its central processor. The array didn't explode or malfunction. It simply stopped working. Every system dead simultaneously, as if something had reached into its core and switched off the fundamental principles that made it function. Hal's ring vibrated with an incoming message. Priority 1 from Oa. All lanterns, immediate withdrawal. Fall back to defensive positions around critical infrastructure. New orders: do not engage. Do not attempt containment. Protect and evacuate only. The admission hurt worse than any injury. The Green Lantern Corps, the peacekeeping force that had maintained order across the universe for billions of years, was retreating. Not regrouping for a counterattack. Retreating because they'd finally encountered something that rendered their fundamental power irrelevant. Hal took one last look at the intruder. It was approaching the system's star now, gliding toward that massive nuclear furnace, with the same casual interest it had shown everything else. He didn't stay to see what would happen when it arrived. He turned and burned hard for the sector boundary, leaving behind a graveyard that used to be a thriving corner of civilization. Behind him, the star flickered. The briefing on Oa was short. There was little to brief. The intruder was still moving, still destroying, still spreading. The dead zones now covered 40 sectors and growing. Projected path suggested it would reach the galactic core within 3 weeks at current pace. But it didn't move in straight lines. That was what made tracking impossible. It would drift through one region, then appear in another sector entirely, then return to its original path. No pattern, no logic. Just wandering destruction. "We need to understand what it wants," one Guardian said. Hal shook his head. "It doesn't want anything. That's the problem. Want implies desire, motivation, purpose. This thing just is. It exists, and existence can't contain it, so existence breaks." The Guardians considered this. Then one spoke the words that confirmed what everyone in the chamber already knew. "Then this is beyond the Corps' capacity to resolve. We must seek assistance from those who operate on different principles." The message to Earth had already been sent. Now they waited for a response, hoping that the Justice League had faced enough impossible threats to have some framework for dealing with one more. In Sector 872, the last evacuation ship cleared the boundary. The entire sector was declared a dead zone, quarantined, to be avoided until further notice. What remained behind drifted among the debris of 17 worlds and 4 billion lives. It found a small asteroid, unremarkable, probably never noticed by any sapient eye before that moment. It touched the asteroid. The asteroid scattered into powder. The entity moved on expression unchanged, seeking the next thing to unmake. And in its wake, the universe bled. The alert reached the watchtower at 3:47 hours Earth Standard Time. Batman was already there. He didn't sleep much these days, and when he did, he kept one part of his mind tethered to the monitoring systems. The quantum band transmission from OA carried encryption protocols he'd only seen twice before, both times preceding events that rewrote the structure of reality itself. He read the message once. Then he activated the priority assembly beacon. Within 8 minutes, the core team materialized in the conference chamber. Superman arrived first, still wearing civilian clothes, but already shifting into the mindset that separated Clark Kent from what he became when the world needed saving. Wonder Woman came next, her armor gleaming even under the watchtower's sterile lighting. Wally West appeared in a red blur, his expression already grim. He'd learned to read Batman's body language over the years, and right now every line of Bruce's posture screamed catastrophe. "Show us," Diana said. No preamble. She recognized that look too. Batman activated the holographic display. The image from Oa filled the space between them. A small figure, pink and white, frozen mid-motion against a backdrop of debris that used to be populated worlds. Even in a still frame, something about it registered as fundamentally wrong. The proportions weren't quite right. The way it occupied space felt like an optical illusion that refused to resolve. "Green Lantern Corps sent this 16 minutes ago," Batman said. 40 sectors silent. Estimated casualties in the trillions. They've lost 19 lanterns attempting containment. Current classification reality breach. "What does that mean?" Wally asked. "Something came through from another universe. The bleed is damaged. Has been since the last crisis. Something fell through the gaps." Batman pulled up a tactical map showing the spread of dead zones. "It's not invading. It's not conquering. It's simply moving, and everything it touches stops functioning." Superman studied the image, his expression hardening. He'd fought doomsday darkside beings that could shatter planets with their fists. But those were combatants. This felt different. "What do the Guardians recommend?" "They don't. They're requesting assistance because none of their protocols apply. Will doesn't contain it. Force doesn't stop it. It exists outside the framework they use to maintain order." Diana stepped closer to the hologram, her warrior's instinct trying to find weaknesses, attack vectors, anything that could be exploited. "Then we need to understand what it is before we can determine how to face it." "No time," Batman said flatly. "It's accelerating. Current trajectory puts it in our solar system within 72 hours. The silence that followed carried weight. 72 hours. 3 days to prepare for something that had already broken the Green Lantern Corps. "We need to see it," Superman said finally. "Not images, not reports. We need to understand what we're dealing with." Batman had anticipated this. "Watchtower sensors are already tracking it. Best visual feed is from Sector 901, one of the last monitoring stations still operational in the affected region." The hologram shifted. Real-time footage now grainy but clear enough. The entity moved through the wreckage of what had been a thriving star system. No urgency in its motion, no apparent awareness of being observed. It simply existed, and where it existed, reality struggled to maintain coherence. They watched it approach a derelict space station. The structure was already dead, its crew evacuated hours before. The entity reached out a gesture almost gentle and touched the station's hull. The metal didn't crumple or explode. It lost definition, became less. The atomic bonds that held it together simply stopped acknowledging the forces that should have kept them stable. Within seconds, what had been a solid structure was an expanding cloud of elementary particles. "Dear God," Wally whispered. He felt something else, too, something he couldn't quite articulate. The speed force felt different here. Noisy. Like static over a radio signal. Batman's jaw tightened. It's done that to 17 inhabited worlds, hundreds of installations. Every Green Lantern that's tried direct engagement. "Then we don't engage directly," Diana said. But her hand had moved unconsciously to her sword. Old instincts. "We evacuate. We protect. We contain." The Corps tried containment. It walked through barriers that should have held planets. Superman's eyes never left the feed. The entity had moved on, approaching a moon that still held a small research outpost. He could see the structure's lights, could imagine the people inside scrambling to evacuate, praying they had enough time. Someone has to try. Someone has to stand between that thing and the people who can't protect themselves. Batman pulled up another display. I've been analyzing the combat data from OA. Every successful engagement follows the same pattern. The entity doesn't pursue. It doesn't adapt. It simply exists in spaces, and if you're not in those spaces, you survive. You're saying we run, Diana said. Not quite accusatory, but close. I'm saying we choose our battles. We can't stop it by force. We've seen that. But we can save people. We can evacuate populations ahead of its path. We can buy time to find an actual solution. And if there is no solution, Wally asked. Batman looked at him directly. Then we learn how to live in a universe with a walking apocalypse in it. The conference lasted another 30 minutes. Plans formed, assignments, distributed, contingencies established. Superman would coordinate with the remaining Green Lantern forces, use his speed and durability to extract civilians from high-risk zones. Wonder Woman would lead defensive operations, establishing safe corridors for evacuation. Wally would run reconnaissance, mapping the entity's movements, looking for patterns that might predict its next appearance. And Batman would do what he did best. Analyze, calculate, search for the weakness that everything possessed, because nothing could exist without limitations. By 0430 hours, they were moving. The entity reached the research outpost 7 minutes after the last transport cleared the moon's gravity well. The scientists aboard that vessel watched their life's work dissolve into cosmic dust. No explosion. No fire. Just cessation. Superman intercepted the transport's distress beacon. They had lost main engines in the panic and guided them to a safe harbor 3 systems over. The gratitude in their voices hurt more than any physical wound. They thanked him for saving them. He couldn't tell them he'd only delayed their displacement. That thing was still out there, still moving, still unmaking everything in its path. He found the entity in the debris field that used to be the research station. Up close, it was worse than the briefings had suggested. The wrongness wasn't just visual, it was metaphysical. Standing near it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff where the fall never ended. The entity looked at him. Superman had faced beings that could crack worlds. He'd stared down Darkseid, fought Doomsday to exhaustion, held the line against threats that should have ended everything. But this thing's gaze carried no malice, no recognition, no acknowledgement of Superman as an obstacle or ally or anything at all. It looked at him the way someone might look at a stone in a path present but not relevant. "I don't know if you can understand me," Superman said, keeping his voice steady. "But you need to stop. You're destroying inhabited space, killing trillions. If there's any consciousness in there, any capacity to comprehend what you're doing." The entity tilted its head. The motion was smooth, too smooth, as if its neck had no bones or joints or any of the limitations that physical form should impose. Then it did something unexpected. It copied him. Not a transformation, not absorption. It simply mirrored his stance, his cape's drape, the way he held himself in zero gravity. An imperfect mimicry, like a child's drawing of Superman, rendered in 3 dimensions by something that didn't quite understand the source material. Superman felt ice in his chest. This wasn't adaptation or mockery. This was observation without comprehension. The entity saw him as a shape to replicate nothing more. "You really don't understand, do you?" Superman said quietly. "You're not evil. You're not even malicious. You just are. The entity's mimicry dissolved, back to its original form. Then it turned away from Superman entirely, as if he'd ceased to be interesting, and began moving toward the next target on whatever incomprehensible trajectory governed its path. Superman could have pursued, could have placed himself in its way, forced a confrontation. But Batman's analysis echoed in his mind. Force doesn't stop it. And more importantly, we can't save anyone if we're destroyed trying to fight the unfightable. So he did the hardest thing. He let it go. Turned back toward the evacuation zones, toward the people who still needed extraction, toward the battles he could actually win. Behind him, another moon dissolved into nothing. Diana found the entity 3 hours later, near a colony world that held 6 billion people. The evacuation was in progress, but it would take days to move that many civilians. Days they didn't have if the projections were accurate. She descended from orbit like a falling star, landing between the advancing threat and the nearest population center. Her shield was raised, her sword drawn. Every instinct screamed to attack, to test herself against this thing that had broken so many others. But she held position, watched, learned. The entity approached a small structure on the colony's outskirts. Agricultural equipment, automated farming systems that fed a quarter of the planet. It reached out with that same gentle motion Superman had described. Diana moved without thinking. Her lasso snapped forward, coiling around the entity's wrist, pulling back. The lasso of truth forged in Hephaestus's fires, capable of binding gods themselves. For exactly 2 seconds the lasso held. Then the entity simply stopped acknowledging it existed. The rope fell away, not broken or severed, just suddenly empty, as if it had never contained anything at all. The entity continued its motion, uninterrupted, touched the agricultural center. The structure's dissolution was almost beautiful in its horror. Every system failing simultaneously, not from damage, but from the fundamental erasure of the bonds that held it together. Within 30 seconds, complex machinery worth billions of credits was elemental dust drifting on the wind. Diana tried again. Sword this time. The blade had cut through enchantments, divine armor, the scales of monsters that predated language itself. She swung with precision, not trying to kill you, couldn't kill what might not be alive, but to sever, to divide, to force a reaction. The blade passed through the entity without resistance. Through. Not cutting, not parting. Simply occupying the same space for a moment before emerging on the other side, unbloodied and ineffective. The entity turned to look at her. No aggression, no defense. Just that empty regard that Superman had tried to warn her about. You can't be reasoned with, Diana said, lowering her weapons. You can't be fought. You can't even be contained. She stepped back, accepting what her warrior's pride didn't want to admit. Then, I'll do what I can do. I'll save who I can save. She launched back into the sky toward the evacuation zones, toward the ships that needed protection, toward the people who needed a warrior willing to admit when the battle couldn't be won through strength alone. The entity watched her go, with the same empty curiosity it showed everything. Then it moved on to the next target. Wally ran the perimeter of the dead zones, trying to map the entity's path. His speed was his advantage. He could observe from a distance chart its movements stay ahead of the destruction. But the more he mapped, the less sense it made. No pattern, no logic. The entity would move in one direction for hours, then appear halfway across a sector, then return to its previous trajectory. Quantum scans showed space-time distortions wherever it appeared. But the readings were inconsistent. Sometimes it looked like teleportation, sometimes like it had simply always been. In the new location, and never been in the old one. And there was something else. Something that made his instincts scream warnings he couldn't quite interpret. His phasing didn't feel clean here. The bleed distortions made the speed force stutter like trying to run on a surface that kept shifting underfoot. Every time he tapped into that connection, there was interference. Static. Wrong frequencies overlapping where they shouldn't. He tried baiting it once, ran close, vibrated his molecules to different frequencies, attempting to draw its attention away from a populated station. The entity watched him run. Watched with what might have been curiosity, or might have been nothing at all. Then it turned back to the station and reached out. Wally couldn't save them all. Even moving at near light speed, he couldn't evacuate an entire station in the seconds it took for the entity to reduce it to dust. He saved maybe 30 people. 30 out of 3,000. He remembered their faces, every single one he couldn't reach. By 1200 hours, Earth Standard, the Justice League, had its first comprehensive assessment. Superman delivered it in the Watchtower conference chamber, his voice steady, but his eyes carrying the weight of what he'd witnessed. It's not a combatant. It's a natural disaster with a shape. And we have no framework for stopping it. Batman nodded. He'd reached the same conclusion, analyzing the data. Evacuation is our only viable strategy. We protect what we can protect. We accept what we can't. That's not acceptable, Diana said, but there was no heat in her voice, just exhaustion. She'd been fighting for 12 hours straight, and the enemy had never once acknowledged her as a threat. It's reality, Batman replied. We can't save everyone, but we can save millions if we stop trying to fight and start focusing on extraction. And when it reaches Earth, Wally asked, when it reaches the systems we've sworn to protect? The question hung in the air, because that was the inevitable conclusion. The entity was still moving, still accelerating, still spreading, and eventually it would reach the worlds they called home. Then we buy time, Batman said. We evacuate. We move populations to safe zones. We hope that somewhere someone finds a solution that we can't see yet. Superman looked at the star map, at the spreading red zones that marked dead space. There has to be a way. There's always a way. But for the first time in his career as Earth's greatest hero, he said it without conviction. Because he'd looked into that thing's eyes and seen nothing. No evil to oppose, no plan to disrupt. Just existence raw and terrible and utterly indifferent to the suffering it caused. And that was so much worse than any villain he'd ever faced. The entity continued its path. Behind it, the silence spread. Ahead of it, civilizations held their breath and prayed that they would be overlooked, that the wandering apocalypse would pass them by. Some prayers were answered, most weren't. And in the Watchtower, the Justice League learned what the Green Lantern Corps had already discovered, that sometimes the universe breaks, and all you can do is protect the pieces that remain. Wally West had spent 3 days running. Not continuously, though there were stretches where he pushed himself for hours without stopping. 3 days mapping trajectories, charting destruction patterns, trying to find logic in chaos. 3 days watching worlds die while he documented their deaths with the cold precision of someone who knew information might be the only weapon they had left. The entity had no pattern. He'd confirmed that much. But patterns weren't the only way to predict behavior. Sometimes you could predict by understanding what something wanted. Sometimes by knowing what it feared. This thing wanted nothing, feared nothing. And that made it more dangerous than any villain Wally had ever faced. He stood now at the edge of Sector 618, watching the entity drift through the ruins of what had been a trading hub. Thousands of species had mingled here, exchanging goods and culture and ideas. Now, it was debris and silence. The entity paused near a cluster of derelict vessels. Refugee ships, by the look of them. Already abandoned their crews, evacuated days ago when the warnings first reached this far. The entity reached toward the nearest hull with that same gentle motion it used for everything. Wally felt the speed force around him stutter again. That wrongness he'd been tracking for days, getting worse the closer he got to the affected zones. The connection felt thin here, like trying to grasp water with numb fingers. He'd reported it to Batman. Bruce had added it to his growing list of anomalies variables that didn't fit any existing framework. The bleed damage is interacting with dimensional energies, he'd said, including the speed force. Be careful. Careful? Right. Because there was a safe way to study a walking apocalypse. The entity finished with the refugee ships, reduced them to elementary particles, and turned. Not toward anything specific, just turned searching for the next thing to unmake. Its gaze swept across empty space and found Wally. For 3 heartbeats, neither moved. Wally had been careful until now, keeping his distance, observing without engaging. But something in that empty regard changed the calculation. The entity wasn't just looking at him. It was noticing him. Wally ran. Not away. That would be useless. The entity could appear anywhere cross distances without traveling. Running away meant abandoning the evacuation zone he was supposed to be protecting, a mining colony with 200,000 workers still loading transport vessels. He ran perpendicular to the entity's position, creating distance laterally, trying to draw its attention away from the colony. His speed left a crimson streak across the void, visible even in vacuum, a trail of exotic particles that marked his passage through space-time. The entity watched him run, its head tracking the movement with that too smooth rotation. Then it followed. Not running, not flying, just existing in different positions along Wally's path, appearing in discrete jumps that made no physical sense. One moment behind him, the next ahead, then beside, like a film with frames missing, showing only the key positions without the transition. Wally altered course, banking hard toward an asteroid field. Complex terrain, obstacles. Maybe he could use the environment, create barriers, force the entity to move in predictable ways. The entity appeared directly in his path. Wally phased. Pure instinct. His molecules shifted frequency, vibrating at the precise rate that would let him pass through solid matter. He'd done it 1,000 times, passed through walls, weapons, even other people when necessary. He passed through the entity. For exactly half a second, he occupied the same space as that thing. And in that half second, Wally experienced something he'd never felt before. Not pain, not cold, just wrongness so profound it made his entire being recoil, like touching something that existed in negative space, in the gaps between what should be possible. Then he was through, reforming on the other side, molecules re-establishing their normal bonds. He kept running. 3 more jumps, building distance, his heart hammering not from exertion, but from the memory of that contact. He'd touched nothing. Passed through empty space wearing a shape. And somehow, that was worse than any physical strike could have been. The entity turned to follow again. Wally led it away from the colony toward the outer system, toward empty space where nothing remained to be destroyed. The entity pursued with that same empty curiosity appearing in his wake, watching him move. Batman, Wally said, his comm active even at speed. It's following me. Confirmed. We're tracking. Bruce's voice was steady. Can you maintain this pattern? As long as I need to. The colony. Evacuation 60% complete. Keep it occupied for another hour. An hour. Wally could run for an hour. He'd run for longer when necessary. Time became strange at these speeds, anyway stretching and compressing in ways that made clock measurements feel arbitrary. He banked around a gas giant using its gravity to add velocity, then shot back out into open space. The entity appeared ahead of him again, always ahead now, as if it had learned to anticipate his trajectory. Wally altered course. The entity adjusted, appeared where he was going to be, not where he'd been. It was learning. No, not learning. That implied processing adaptation intelligence applied to experience. This was something else. The entity was simply becoming more synchronized with the pattern of Wally's movement, like a child learning to catch a ball by watching it fly. Wally ran faster, pushed deeper into the speed force tapping reserves he usually kept in check. The world blurred around him, colors shifting as his velocity approached theoretical limits. At these speeds, seconds stretched into subjective minutes. He had time to think, to plan, to notice things that would be invisible at normal perception. He noticed the bleed distortions getting worse. Space itself looked wrong here. Hairline fractures in reality visible only to someone moving fast enough to see between the moments. The damaged membrane between dimensions was showing through, and wherever those cracks appeared, the speed force felt corrupted. Wrong frequencies, discordant vibrations. The entity appeared directly in front of him again. Wally had no time to alter course. He phased again, molecules shifting, preparing to pass through the bleed shear hit him. It wasn't an attack. It was just a momentary alignment, a point where the dimensional damage intersected with the speed force in exactly the wrong way. For one fraction of a second, the frequency Wally was vibrating at didn't match the frequency reality was operating on. His phasing stuttered, caught, like a gear slipping in a machine. He was still vibrating when the entity's hand swept across his path. Contact. Wally felt himself pulled. Not physically, worse than physically. His molecules, still out of phase with normal matter, suddenly found themselves in phase with something else. Something that existed in the gaps in the spaces between atoms. The entity's form opened. Not splitting or tearing, just becoming hollow, creating a space that hadn't existed a moment before. And Wally's still vibrating wrong, still caught in that stuttered frequency, couldn't stop his momentum from carrying him forward. Into it. The sensation was indescribable. Not being swallowed. Not being absorbed in any biological sense. It was like falling through a trap door that only existed because he was moving at exactly the wrong speed, in exactly the wrong way. The speed force connection screamed. Wally felt it stretching, straining, trying to pull him back. But he was already too deep, already inside whatever passed for the entity's interior, and the laws that governed his existence didn't apply here. He tried to vibrate free, to phase back out the way he'd phased in. But the frequencies were all wrong. The entity's interior existed in a state that had no correlation to normal space-time. There was no out, because there was no proper in. Just existence in a place that shouldn't have places. His last conscious thought before the speed force connection broke entirely was a simple one. Bruce was right. I should have been more careful. Then the connection severed. Not violently, just ended. Like a radio signal fading to static. The entity reformed, whole again, unchanged. Its expression, that blank face that might have been neutral, or might have been anything, remained exactly as it had been before. But something else was different now. In the watchtower, Batman's screens lit up with alerts. He was on his feet instantly, fingers flying across holographic interfaces, pulling up data streams, sensor feeds, anything that could tell him what had just happened. Superman arrived seconds later. "What is it? Wally?" Batman's voice was flat, controlled. "He's gone." Diana materialized in the transport pad. "Gone where?" "Into it." Batman pulled up the tracking data. Wally's biosignature had been clean and strong right up until the moment of contact. Then it had simply stopped. Not died. Not traveled elsewhere. Just stopped existing in any way their sensors could detect. "His ring," Superman said. "The Speed Force connection. Severed." Batman was already running probability matrices, searching for scenarios where this could be reversed. The numbers were not encouraging. Whatever that thing is, it doesn't just destroy matter. It incorporates it, absorbs it. And Wally was phasing when contact occurred. Diana's hand moved to her sword. Warrior instinct. "Then we get him back." "How?" Batman didn't look up from his screens. "We don't know where Bakit Majbak is. We don't know if there's a him left to retrieve. We don't even know if concepts like location and identity apply to whatever state he's in now." Superman moved to the viewport, looking out at the stars at the distant sector where Wally had been running just minutes ago. "There has to be a way." "Hope isn't strategy, Clark." Batman's fingers paused over the keyboard. A new alert was flashing. "And we have a bigger problem." The holographic display shifted, showing the entity again, still in Sector 6118, still moving through the evacuation zone with that same wandering path. But now it was moving faster. Not running, not accelerating in any conventional sense, just covering distances more quickly, appearing in positions farther apart with the same interval between jumps, as if whatever governed its movement had been given more range. "It's using his speed," Diana said quietly. Batman nodded. "Preliminary analysis suggests the entity can access absorbed properties. Wally's connection to the Speed Force was severed, but the entity now demonstrates enhanced mobility, consistent with tachyon-level displacement." "English, Bruce," Superman said. "It absorbed the Flash. Now it can move like him." The implications hung in the air. The entity had been catastrophic enough at its previous pace, appearing in scattered locations impossible to predict or intercept. But if it could now cover distances at super speed, if it could flash between sectors in seconds rather than hours, the galaxy didn't have days anymore. It had hours, maybe less. "We need to warn everyone," Superman said. "Every outpost, every colony, every civilization within the affected region. They need to evacuate now." "Already sending the broadcasts." Batman's expression was stone. "But there's something else, something worse." He pulled up a new data set. Energy readings from Sector 6118 taken in the minutes after Wally's disappearance. The bleed distortions had changed, intensified, as if the entity's movement was now creating larger ripples in damaged reality. "The Speed Force interaction is destabilizing the bleed further," Batman said. "Every time it moves at super speed, it's tearing at dimensional barriers, making the damage worse." "Can we contain it?" Diana asked. "No." Batman finally looked up from his screens. "But we might be able to trap it. If we can find a space that exists outside normal reality, a place where its nature wouldn't matter, because the rules are already broken." "The Speed Force itself," Superman said, understanding, crystallizing. "If Wally's inside it, his connection might still exist. And if we could push it entirely into that dimension, it would be contained in a place where speed is the fundamental principle. Batman pulled up schematics, theoretical models of dimensional topology. The Speed Force exists partially outside normal space-time. If we could force the entity fully into that realm, seal it there, it would be trapped in a prison whose nature it can't unmake. Because it would already be unmade, Diana said. The Speed Force is pure kinetic energy. No matter to dissolve, no structure to destroy. Theoretically, Batman's tone suggested low confidence in the theory, but actually executing such a plan would require resources we don't have. Power sources capable of bridging dimensions, anchor points to keep the portal stable, and someone to actually force it through the breach. Someone fast, Superman said. Someone who understands the Speed Force intimately. Someone the entity might actually follow. Batman closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his expression was grim. We'd need another speedster. The silence stretched, because there was only one other speedster who fit those criteria. Only one person who knew the Speed Force well enough to navigate its depths, who had the experience to survive what they were proposing. Barry Allen. And what they were proposing would likely kill him. Contact Barry, Superman said finally. Tell him everything. Give him the choice. Batman nodded, started composing the message. But they all knew what Barry's answer would be, because that's what heroes did. They chose the hard thing. They paid the price that needed paying. Meanwhile, thousands of light years away, the entity that now moved with stolen speed continued its path. Behind its sectors went silent. Ahead of it, civilizations held their breath. And inside it, in a place that wasn't quite a place, Wally West existed in a state that wasn't quite existence. Conscious, but not aware. Present, but not participating. Caught in a space between being and unbeing. Waiting, though for what even he could no longer remember. The first indication came from an automated monitoring station in Sector 445. The station detected the entity's signature at 0823 hours. Standard protocol, engaged tracking algorithms, activated predictive models, calculating trajectory evacuation warnings transmitted to nearby systems. The station's AI estimated 12 hours before the threat reached populated space. At 0824 hours, the entity appeared in Sector 441, 4 sectors away. Instantaneously, the AI recalculated, flagged the reading as sensor error, ran diagnostics. At 0825 hours, the entity was in Sector 438, then 434, then 429. The AI stopped trying to calculate. It simply screamed warnings into the void and hoped someone was listening. In the watchtower, Batman watched the cascade of alerts with the cold focus of someone watching a worst-case scenario unfold in real time. The entity was no longer moving through space. It was skipping across it, appearing in discrete locations, with no regard for the distance between them. It's not just moving faster, he said to the assembled team. It's moving wrong. Superman studied the tactical display. The entity's path looked like someone had taken a pen and stabbed dots across a map at random. No trajectory, no linear progression, just presence in multiple locations separated by impossible distances, all within minutes of each other. Wally could run between dimensions, Diana said quietly. Could this thing be doing the same, possibly? Batman pulled up comparative data. But Wally controlled his dimensional shifts. He chose destinations. This appears random. It's simply existing in different places without understanding the concept of travel. Which makes it impossible to predict, Superman said. Which makes it impossible to evacuate ahead of. Batman's jaw tightened. Every model we've built assumed we'd have hours, maybe days, of warning. Now, we have minutes. The entity appeared in Sector 391, a heavily populated region, 6 inhabited systems, billions of lives. It appeared near a transport hub first, a massive station where shipping lanes from a dozen sectors converged. The station's sensors detected the signature-triggered emergency protocols, began evacuation procedures. 3 minutes later, the entity was inside the station's central hub. Not outside. Not approaching. Inside. As if it had simply decided the interior was its current location and reality had bent to accommodate. The station's structure lasted 16 seconds, long enough for 2 evacuation ships to clear the docking bays. Not long enough for the 3rd, 4th, or 5th vessels. They dissolved along with the infrastructure that held them, their crews and passengers reduced to constituent atoms before they could even comprehend the danger. The entity emerged from the expanding debris field and shifted position again. It appeared at one of the sector's inhabited planets, a world called Tarna Prime, home to 3 billion people who'd built a civilization spanning 4 continents and 2 moons. They'd survived wars, plagues, environmental collapse. They'd rebuilt, adapted, grown stronger with each challenge. They had no defense against something that existed in their upper atmosphere one moment and in their planetary core the next. The entity didn't destroy the planet directly. It simply moved through it, occupying spaces that happened to contain essential infrastructure. Power generation facilities, atmospheric processors, tectonic stabilizers that kept the volatile world from tearing itself apart. Each appearance lasted seconds. Each disappearance left catastrophic failure cascading through systems that had maintained civilization for thousands of years. Within an hour, Tarna Prime was dying, not from external attack, from internal collapse, their own world consuming itself, because the mechanisms that kept it habitable were gone. Green Lantern reinforcements arrived to find 3 billion people trapped on a planet with hours left before total biosphere failure. They organized the evacuation with desperate efficiency, but the numbers were brutal. The transport capacity simply didn't exist to move that many people that quickly. They saved 800 million. The entity had already moved on. It appeared in a mining operation on the sector's edge. A small colony, barely 5,000 workers extracting rare elements from an asteroid field. The colony was so remote, so insignificant, that evacuation warnings hadn't even reached them yet. The entity appeared in their refining facility. Then their habitation modules. Then their emergency shelters. 5,000 became 0 in the time it took for the automated systems to send their final status report. Superman reached the sector too late to save Tarna Prime. He arrived in time to watch the planet's atmospheric envelope burn away, to see the oceans boil off into space, to witness 3 billion years of evolution reduced to a sterile rock in a matter of hours. He'd seen worlds die before, had fought desperate battles to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophe. But those had been battles. Enemies he could face, systems. He could repair disasters. He could slow or stop through application of his considerable abilities. This was just loss. Pure and simple and absolute. He found the entity near one of Tyarna's moons. The satellite was small, barely large enough to hold a research station. 20 scientists studying ancient impact craters. They'd evacuated successfully, their emergency protocol triggered in time. The entity floated amid the empty structures they'd left behind, its blank expression unchanged. It reached toward the research station, and Superman put himself between them. No more. His voice carried across the vacuum broadcast on every frequency, not because he thought it would understand, because he needed to say it. Needed to draw a line somewhere, even if that line was arbitrary and would be crossed the moment he blinked. The entity regarded him with that same empty curiosity. Then it was behind him. No blur of motion, no indication of movement, just a sudden rewriting of position. Superman spun faster than sound, faster than light, drawing on reserves of speed that made him nearly as fast as the speedsters themselves. He caught the entity reaching for the research station and interposed himself again. "I said no." The entity appeared on his other side, reached again. Superman grabbed its wrist, or tried to. His hand passed through the entity's arm without resistance, as if he were grasping smoke that happened to be opaque. The entity completed its motion, touched the research station. Superman could only watch as the structure containing the life's work of 2 decades of research, thousands of preserved samples, irreplaceable data, ceased to exist. He'd failed. Again. He was arguably the most powerful being on Earth, and he couldn't stop this thing from destroying an empty building. The entity turned its attention to the moon itself, lifted both arms in that same gentle gesture. No. Superman hit it with everything he had. Heat vision at maximum intensity, the kind that could vaporize mountains. The beam struck the entity dead center and passed through, as if it occupied a slightly different phase of reality, present enough to interact with matter when it chose, but fundamentally disconnected from the forces that should have affected it. The entity brought its arms down. The moon didn't explode. It simply stopped being geologically stable. Its core lost cohesion. The gravitational forces that held it together became suggestions rather than laws. Within seconds, what had been a sphere was an expanding cloud of rock and ice. Superman pulled back, unable to watch another failure, unable to bear the weight of another loss he couldn't prevent. Diana found the entity 4 hours later near a civilian convoy. 30 ships carrying refugees from half a dozen worlds, all fleeing toward a sector that was still considered safe. The entity appeared directly in the convoy's path. Diana didn't hesitate. She flew straight at it, sword drawn, every instinct screaming that this was futile, but unable to override millennia of warrior conditioning that demanded she at least try. The entity shifted position, appeared behind the convoy's lead vessel. Diana changed course, keeping herself between the threat and the civilians. The entity appeared ahead of her. She altered trajectory. It appeared beside her. They danced like this for 3 minutes. Diana desperately trying to maintain a defensive position, while the entity simply explored different positions in space, apparently fascinated by her attempts to predict its movements. Then it stopped playing. The entity appeared inside one of the convoy vessels. Not near it. Inside it, occupying the same space as the ship's reactor core. The vessel had a crew of 200. Families, children, people who'd already lost their homes and were fleeing toward hope. The explosion was bright enough to be seen from 3 systems away. Diana caught the survivors from the escort vessels, pulled them to safety while the entity moved on to the next target, utterly indifferent to the destruction it had caused. She wanted to pursue, wanted to force a confrontation, to make it acknowledge her, to fight, even if fighting was useless. But she'd learned the lesson now. Fighting it was worse than useless. Fighting it meant staying near it. Staying near it meant being present when it randomly appeared in a populated space. So she turned away, focused on evacuation, on saving who could be saved, on accepting that sometimes a warrior's duty wasn't to defeat the enemy, but to protect those fleeing from it. The losses accumulated faster than anyone could process. Worlds went silent. Sectors fell off the communication grid. The dead zone spread like a cancer through inhabited space, consuming everything with that same random, terrible consistency. Lantern constructs failed before they could fully form. The entity would appear inside the barriers, render them meaningless by existing where they were supposed to exclude. Automated defense systems fired at empty space or at positions the entity had already vacated. The weapons themselves failed when it appeared near their power sources or control mechanisms. Evacuation ships fled at maximum velocity, jumping to faster-than-light speeds the moment they cleared gravity wells. Half made it. Half found the entity appearing in their engine rooms or navigation systems. There was no front line, no battlefield, no place that could be defended because every place was potentially where it would be next. Batman coordinated from the watchtower, but coordination required prediction, and prediction required pattern. There was no pattern, just chaos wearing a shape. "We're losing," he said to Clark during a brief communication window. "Not slowly, not gradually. We're losing quickly, and we're running out of places to lose." "The plan," Superman said. "The Speed Force trap. Is it ready?" Barry's agreed. "He understands what we're asking." Batman's voice was flat, but Clark heard the undertone. Bruce didn't often ask people to die. The theoretical framework is sound. The practical execution is problematic. How problematic? We'd need to create a stable dimensional breach large enough to push it through. That requires power sources we don't currently have. Dimensional anchors, a way to make it follow Barry instead of appearing somewhere random. So we need time to prepare. We need time we don't have. The entity's accelerated movement means it'll reach Earth's sector within 20 hours. Maybe less. Superman looked out at the stars, at the vast dark between worlds, at the fragile lights of civilization flickering against the void. Then we make time. We slow it down. "How?" Batman asked. "Every attempt at containment has failed. Every barrier, every strategy, we give it something to be interested in, something that moves, something fast enough to make it chase instead of wander." Understanding crystallized. "You can't move that fast, Clark, and Barry needs to be preserved for the trap." "I know." Superman's expression hardened. "But there are others. Speedsters scattered across the galaxy. The Corps has members who can breach dimensional barriers. We gather everyone who can move fast, and we play keep away until you can finalize the trap." That's not a plan. That's a delaying tactic. Right now, Bruce delaying is winning. The entity appeared in a research station orbiting a white dwarf. The station was studying stellar decay, measuring emissions building models that would help predict when dying stars might go supernova. 16 scientists, completely absorbed in their work, barely noticed the alerts until it was too late. One survivor. A graduate assistant who'd been doing maintenance on an exterior telescope array. She watched through the viewport as her colleagues and mentors simply stopped existing, their workspace dissolving around them. She was picked up 8 hours later by a Lantern Patrol catatonic with shock. The medical team couldn't tell if she'd ever recover. Her mind had broken trying to process what she'd witnessed. She wasn't alone. Across the affected regions, survivors struggled with a particular kind of trauma. Not the trauma of violence, which could be processed, understood, even overcome. This was the trauma of witnessing causality fail, of watching the fundamental rules of existence become optional. Many didn't recover. Some took their own lives rather than face a universe where such things were possible. Others retreated into catatonic states, their minds refusing to accept what they'd seen. The entity continued its path indifferent to the psychological wreckage it left behind alongside the physical destruction. It appeared in a habitation sphere, then a medical facility, then a school. It didn't target them specifically. They were simply places it existed for a few moments before moving on. But those moments were enough. After 48 hours of this accelerated destruction, the casualty estimates became meaningless. The numbers were too large, too abstract. Trillions lost their meaning, became statistics, became noise. In the watchtower, Batman updated his projections. At current rate, the entity would render 20% of known space uninhabitable within a week, 50% within 2 weeks, total galactic collapse within a month. Unless they could execute the trap, unless Barry could run faster than he'd ever run before, draw this thing into a space where its nature wouldn't matter and seal it away forever. Unless Superman could buy the time needed to make that possible. Unless 1,000 variables aligned perfectly and nothing went wrong. Batman looked at the odds, ran the simulations, calculated the probability of success, 3%. He updated the plan anyway, because 3% was better than 0. And 0 was what they'd have if they did nothing. The entity appeared in another sector, and another, and another. Behind it, civilizations ended. Ahead of it, hope dwindled. And somewhere in the space between heroes prepared to attempt the impossible one more time, the summit convened in a place that technically didn't exist. Not the watchtower. Too visible. Too vulnerable to the kind of random appearance that had become the entity's signature. Instead, they gathered in a pocket dimension, accessible only through specific harmonic frequencies, a space that Dr. Fate had maintained for centuries as a meeting ground when reality itself became unreliable. The chamber was simple. A circular room with no decorations, no windows, no indication of the void that surrounded it. Just a table, chairs, and the representatives of 3 powers that had protected existence for longer than most civilizations had words. Batman arrived first. He always did. Brought with him data cores containing every scrap of information they'd gathered, every failed strategy, every loss, tallied with brutal precision. Superman and Wonder Woman materialized moments later. Then the Lanterns. Not just Hal Jordan, but Guardians themselves. Small blue figures whose faces betrayed no emotion, but whose presence indicated how seriously Oa took this threat. Dr. Fate appeared without fanfare, bringing with him the weight of order magic and millennia of experience facing things that shouldn't exist. Zatanna stood at his side, younger, but no less capable, her backward speech ready to reshape reality if reality would cooperate. And Barry Allen. The one person everyone was here to ask everything from. He looked tired. Not physically, speedsters didn't tire the way normal humans did. But there was an exhaustion in his eyes that went deeper than muscles and mitochondria. The exhaustion of someone who'd already given everything once and was being asked to do it again. "Thank you all for coming," Batman said. No preamble. No pleasantries. We have less than 18 hours before the entity reaches Earth's sector. We need a solution that works. We need it now. One of the Guardians spoke its voice, resonating with harmonics that suggested multiple frequencies simultaneously. The Green Lantern Corps has attempted every containment protocol in our archives. Physical barriers fail. Energy constructs are bypassed. Even structures built from pure will prove insufficient. Because will operates on principles, Batman said. Rules. The entity doesn't acknowledge rules. It exists in the gaps between what should be possible. Then we need to meet it in those gaps, Dr. Fate said. His voice echoed as if spoken from multiple places at once. The Speed Force is itself a gap. A space between physics and impossibility. If we could force the entity entirely into that dimension, it would be contained in a prison whose nature matches its own. Superman finished. We discussed this. But the execution, requires anchors. Batman interrupted. He activated a holographic projection, showed schematics, theoretical models, calculations that had taken him 6 hours of continuous work to compile. 3-dimensional anchors positioned in a triangle configuration. Each anchor generates a harmonic frequency that resonates with the speed force. Combined, they create a breach large enough for the entity to pass through. Zatanna studied the projection. The power requirements are enormous. We're talking about tearing a hole between dimensions and holding it stable long enough to push something through. "We have the Watchtower's main reactor," Superman said. "The central power battery on Oa. Between them, still insufficient by 30%, Batman said flatly. "I've run the numbers 100 times. We need a third source." "The Rock of Eternity," Dr. Fate said. All eyes turned to him. "The foundation of order magic. It exists partially outside normal space-time, drawing power from the fundamental forces that maintain reality. If we could tap into that source..." That's not your decision to make alone," Zatanna said carefully. "No. It would require the agreement of the entire Council of Eternity, which I do not have time to convene." Fate's golden helmet regarded them all. "But I am willing to accept the consequences of acting without that agreement, if it saves existence." Diana leaned forward. "Even if we create the breach, how do we ensure the entity goes through it? Every attempt to force it anywhere has failed." All eyes turned to Barry. He'd been silent until now, standing at the edge of the gathering, listening to them plan around what they needed him to do. Now he met their gazes one by one. "You need someone to lead it in," he said quietly. "Someone fast enough to make it chase. Someone who understands the speed force well enough to navigate it from the inside." "Yes," Batman said. The single word carried weight. "And once I'm inside, once it follows me through, we collapse the breach behind you." Batman didn't look away, didn't soften it. Seal it, make it permanent. The entity would be trapped in a dimension where it can't unmake matter because there is no matter. Only motion, only speed. And me, silence. Because they all knew the answer. Had known from the moment Batman proposed this plan. Barry would be trapped too, in the speed force, forever, with that thing. "There might be a way back," Superman said. "Once the entity is contained, once we've had time to study the problem." "Clark," Barry's voice was gentle. "Don't. We both know there isn't." Superman looked at him. Two men who'd fought beside each other for years, saved each other's lives more times than either could count. Brothers in everything but blood. "I can't ask you to do this," Superman said. "You're not asking. I'm volunteering." "Barry, how many people have died in the last 48 hours? Barry's voice remained steady. "How many more will die in the next 18? We're not talking about thousands, Clark. We're talking about the end of galactic civilization. Maybe the end of everything." "One life against trillions," Wonder Woman said softly. "The math is clear, but that doesn't make it right." "No," Barry finally allowed himself a small, sad smile. "But it makes it necessary." Hal Jordan spoke for the first time. "Wally's already in there, inside that thing. If there's any chance at all, that you could find him, pull him out." "I'll try." Barry met Hal's eyes. "I can't promise. I don't know if there's a him left to find, but I'll try." Batman pulled up another schematic. The anchors need to be positioned at specific coordinates, one near Earth, one near OA. The third at the Rock of Eternity. Each location requires defenders. The entity's movement is random, but if it detects the power buildup, it may investigate. "We'll handle Earth," Superman said immediately. "Oa will be defended," a Guardian intoned. "And I will maintain the rock," Dr. Fate said. Batman continued. "Timeline 12 hours to position the anchors and establish power connections. 4 hours to charge the breach generator. 2 hours buffer for complications. The entity reaches Earth's sector in 18 hours. The timing is tight." "What about bait?" Diana asked. "We discussed using speedsters to draw it away from populated zones, to make it chase instead of wander." "I've contacted every speedster I could reach," Barry said. "Most are already evacuating civilians, but a few have agreed to run interference. Create enough motion to keep it interested. Buy us the time we need." "It won't be enough," Batman said. "Not if it maintains its current rate of movement. We need something that will definitely draw its attention. Something it will want to follow more than random destruction." Barry understood. "Me? I run now. Lead it away from the heavily populated core regions. Keep it chasing until the trap is ready." "That puts you at risk for 12 hours, Superman said. "I've run for longer." "Not from something that can appear anywhere. That doesn't need to follow physical laws." "Then I'll be careful." Barry looked around the room. "Is there a better option? Because if there is, I'd love to hear it." No one spoke. "The practical complications," Zatanna said, breaking the silence. "The Speed Force isn't just empty space. It has entities, presences, things that live there. Introducing something like this into that dimension could have consequences we can't predict." "All of this has consequences we can't predict," Batman said. "But the alternative is certain. We do nothing and everything ends." "There's another consideration," one of the Guardians said. "The entity absorbed the speedster Wally West. It now possesses a connection to the Speed Force. If we open a breach, if we create a direct link to that dimension, the entity may be able to access it more completely. Draw greater power from it." "Making it stronger," Diana said. "Potentially, yes." Barry absorbed this. "So the plan is I lead it through a breach that might make it more powerful into a dimension where I'll be trapped forever with it, where it might be able to do even more damage than it's doing here." "Yes," Batman said. "And the chance of success is 3%. Barry laughed. Not with humor. With the kind of exhausted recognition that came from understanding exactly how desperate they were. 3%. We're open to better suggestions." "No." Barry straightened. "No, you're right. 3% is better than 0. And 0 is what we've got if I don't run." "The Speed Force will accept you," Dr. Fate said, his voice carrying a strange certainty. "It has claimed speedsters before, kept them in its embrace. You will not be alone there, Barry Allen. Just me and an entity that unmakes reality for fun." "And possibly Wally," Hal reminded him. "And possibly Wally." Barry nodded. "Then I guess I'd better make sure I know what I'm doing before I go in." Batman pulled up the final schematic. "The breach will form at these coordinates. When you see it open, you run. Full speed. Don't stop. Don't look back. The entity should follow your motion. If it does, if it crosses the threshold, we seal it immediately. What if it doesn't follow? Then the plan fails, and we're back to 0. So no pressure." Superman stood, walked around the table to where Barry stood, put a hand on his shoulder. "We'll remember what you're doing, what you're giving up. Every life that continues because of this, they'll owe their existence to you. They won't know, Barry said. We'll know. That's enough. Barry meant it. He'd never been a hero for the recognition, for the statues or the holidays or the history books. He'd been a hero because people needed heroes, because someone had to stand between the darkness and the light. This was just the final time he'd be that someone. Diana approached next. You embody what the Amazons call Andrea, true courage. Not fearlessness, but action despite fear. I'm terrified, Barry admitted. That's what makes it courage. Hal was last. Find him, Barry. Find Wally. If there's anything left to find, bring him back. I'll do everything I can. The Guardians spoke in unison, their voices harmonizing in a way that suggested formal ritual. The Green Lantern Corps acknowledges your sacrifice. Your name will be recorded in the Book of Oa among those who gave everything for order. Assuming order survives, Barry said. We will make it survive, a Guardian replied. Batman stood. Then we're decided. 12 hours to position, 4 hours to charge, 2 hours buffer. Barry runs interference starting now. One more thing, Barry said. Everyone looked at him. If this works, if I trap it, don't try to get me out. Barry, Superman started. I mean it, Clark. Don't risk opening that prison, ever. Whatever's in there with me, whatever I become, whatever happens, you leave it sealed. You forget there's a door. We can't just promise me. Barry's voice carried absolute certainty. Because if you don't, if you try to rescue me and that thing gets out again, this will all have been for nothing. The silence stretched. Heavy with implications, with the weight of a promise that meant abandoning someone they cared about to a fate worse than death. I promise, Superman said finally. We all do, Diana added. Batman simply nodded. A promise from him was worth more than words from anyone else. Then I guess this is goodbye. Barry looked at each of them, memorizing faces, storing final images of people he'd fought beside, laughed with, trusted with his life. It's been an honor. The honor was ours, Superman said. Barry moved toward the exit, stopped, turned back one last time. Hey, Bruce. Batman looked up from his data cores. Thank you for finding a way. Even if it's a terrible way, even if it's only 3%. Thank you for trying. It's what I do. I know. Barry smiled. It's what we all do. Then he was gone, a streak of red lightning already accelerating toward the first anchor point, already beginning the run that would be his last. The room fell silent. 12 hours, Batman said finally. We'd better not waste them. They dispersed, each to their assigned position, each carrying the weight of what they'd just asked someone to do. Superman remained, looking at the space where Barry had been, thinking about friendship and sacrifice and the terrible mathematics that sometimes demanded one life to save all others. He's going to die, he said quietly. Batman began packing his data cores. He's already dead. The moment he agreed to this, he ceased existing in any future that includes him. We're just determining whether his death means something. You could sound less cold about it. Would that change anything? Would emotion alter the reality that we have no better option? Superman had no answer. 12 hours, Batman repeated. We need to move. They left the pocket dimension, returned to a universe that had 18 hours left before the entity reached Earth. 18 hours to execute a plan with a 3% chance of success. 18 hours to save everything, or lose it all. 12 hours after the summit, The anchors were in position. The first stood in Earth's upper atmosphere, a massive construct of lantern willpower and Kryptonian engineering. Superman had carried the core components into orbit himself, assembling them with the kind of precision that came from years of working in vacuum. Green lanterns from 3 sectors maintained the structure, their rings blazing as they held the dimensional framework stable. The second rested in Oa's core drawing power directly from the central battery. The Guardians themselves had overseen its installation, weaving their ancient knowledge of reality structure into every connection. The chamber glowed with emerald light so intense it would have blinded anyone without protection. The third occupied a space that existed adjacent to normal reality, the Rock of Eternity. Dr. Fate stood at its center, his hands raised, golden energy flowing from his form into the anchor's crystalline structure. The rock sang with power harmonics that resonated through dimensions most beings couldn't perceive, and between the 3 points across thousands of light years of space energy began to flow. Barry felt it as he ran. The speed force responded to the anchors, stretching, thinning, preparing to tear. He'd been running for 11 hours now, a crimson streak across the void, leading the entity away from populated zones through sheer speed and determination. It followed. Not consistently, not predictably, but often enough. Sometimes it would vanish for minutes, appearing in random sectors to unmake whatever it found. But then, Barry would flash past its position, moving so fast that the displacement created a visible wake, and the entity would notice, would turn, would follow. Like a child chasing a bright object. Barry had circled 3 star systems woven through asteroid fields, traced patterns across empty space. His legs should have been molten. His metabolism should have collapsed. But he was the Flash. He'd run across dimensions through time itself. He could run for days if he needed to. He just hoped he wouldn't need to. Barry, Batman's voice through the comm. Anchors at 95% synchronization. 4 more minutes. Copy. Barry altered course, angling toward the coordinates Batman had designated. The convergence point, where the breach would form. Behind him, or beside him, or ahead of him, the entity's movement made spatial relationships meaningless. It continued its pursuit. Barry had learned its rhythm over the past 11 hours. Learned when it would appear, approximately where, how long before it shifted again. Not enough to predict it completely, but enough to stay ahead. 3 minutes. Superman watched the energy readings climb. The anchor above Earth was holding, but barely. The strain of maintaining a dimensional framework was pushing the lantern constructs to their limits. He could see the green light flickering, see the core members gritting their teeth with effort. Hold, he said to them, to himself. Just hold a little longer. At Oa, one of the Guardians spoke. Power transfer at optimal levels. The battery responds well. This will not harm our ability to maintain the core. A necessary question. Because after this, assuming they survived, they would still need the core. Still need order maintained across a galaxy that had been devastated. Structural integrity, another Guardian asked. Stable. The central battery has endured worse than this. It will endure again. 2 minutes. Dr. Fate felt the Rock of Eternity strain beneath the demand. The foundation of order magic was strong, older than most stars, but even it had limits. He'd bypassed the Council's approval for this, had committed the Rock's power without consultation or consent. If he survived, there would be consequences. If he didn't survive, consequences wouldn't matter. Zatanna stood nearby, ready to reinforce the binding if Fate's power faltered. She'd already prepared the spell backwards words that would reshape reality into compliance. But Fate was holding. The golden energy never wavered. Ekrofroi Rofebok, she murmured anyway. A reinforcement. Insurance. The anchor's light intensified. 1 minute. Barry could see it now. Not with eyes his speed made conventional vision useless, but with his connection to the speed force. A point in space where 3 streams of energy converged, where reality was preparing to tear. He angled toward it. Full speed. Pushing past limits he'd carefully maintained for the last 11 hours, drawing on reserves he'd been keeping in check. The entity noticed the acceleration, appeared closer, interested. Good. 30 seconds, Batman said. Breach forming. The convergence point began to glow. Not light in any conventional sense. This was the color of pure speed of motion, made visible of the space between the moments becoming a place. Barry could feel the speed force reaching for him, welcoming him home. It had always felt like home, that place of infinite velocity. He'd touched its edges 1,000 times, dipped into its currents, drawn power from its depths. Now, he was going to live there. Forever. 10 seconds. The entity appeared directly in Barry's path. He didn't slow, didn't alter course, just put his head down and ran, trusting that the entity would do what it had done for the past 11 hours. Let him pass through when their positions intersected. 5 seconds. 4. 3. The entity reached out. 2. Barry felt fingers, or something like fingers. Something that existed in the place where physics became suggestions. Brush his shoulder. 1. The breach opened. Reality split. Not dramatically. No explosion of light or sound. Just a sudden absence, a space where the rules stopped applying. The speed force poured through a river of pure velocity, escaping its confines, and Barry felt it pull at him with the force of a black hole. He didn't resist. Leaned into it. Let it take him. Behind him, the entity followed. It didn't understand pursuit. Didn't comprehend predator and prey. But it understood motion. Understood something moving fast. And 11 hours of watching Barry run had created something like a pattern in its behavior. Something like interest. It crossed the threshold. And for exactly 3 seconds, nothing happened. Barry tumbled through the speed force, feeling its currents catch him, embrace him, pull him deeper into its infinite corridors. He saw other speedsters, echoes of runners pass their forms ghostly and distant. Saw trails of lightning in colors that had no names. Saw time stretching in all directions, past and future existing simultaneously. The entity followed him in. Its form disrupted the currents, created eddies in pure motion. The speed force recoiled, then flowed around it, uncertain what to do with something that existed outside its normal laws. For 3 seconds, the breach remained open. A tier between dimensions held stable by 3 anchors, and more power than most civilizations generated in a year. Then Batman gave the command, "Seal it." At Earth, the lanterns compressed their constructs. The dimensional framework collapsed inward, folding the space where the breach existed, closing the tear with the finality of a door slamming shut. At Oa, the Guardians channeled the central battery's power into sealing harmonics. The green light pulsed once, twice, then stabilized at a frequency that suggested permanence. At the Rock of Eternity, Dr. Fate spoke words in a language that predated language. The anchor's crystalline structure shattered its purpose, fulfilled its energy expended. But the seal held. The breach collapsed. Superman felt it through his enhanced senses the moment when the dimensional barrier re-established itself. Felt the wrongness of the tear healing over. Felt reality sutured closed. "Status, he said into the comm. "Seal confirmed," Batman replied. "The breach is closed, dimensional integrity restored." And Barry, silence, because they all knew the answer. Barry was gone. On the other side of the seal, in a place they couldn't reach, with the entity that had destroyed 40 sectors and killed trillions. He made it through, Batman said finally. So did the target. The seal is holding. The mission is complete. Complete. Such a small word for something so terrible. Diana stood at Earth's anchor point, watching the lanterns disassemble the framework now that it had served its purpose. They worked with efficient precision, but she could see the weight in their movements. They'd just helped seal away one of their own. "Did we do the right thing?" she asked quietly. Hal Jordan floated beside her, his ring dim. "We did the necessary thing. That's not always the same as right." "No," Diana agreed. "It's not." Below them, Earth continued its rotation. Oblivious, safe, alive because someone had chosen to trade his existence for theirs. The civilians would never know. Would wake up tomorrow and worry about their ordinary problems, never realizing how close they'd come to cessation. Never knowing that Barry Allen had saved them by walking into a prison with no escape. "We should tell them," Diana said. "The people. They should know what he sacrificed." "Bruce already decided against it," Hal said. "Says if we tell them, if we make Barry a martyr, it creates pressure to try to rescue him. Better if he's just missing. That's not fair to his memory. Nothing about this is fair." They watched the lanterns work. Watched Earth spin, watched life continue because someone had given everything to preserve it. At Oa, the Guardians assessed the damage to the central battery, minimal. The power drain had been significant, but temporary. The battery would recover. The core would continue. One Guardian spoke what they were all thinking. "We bound a lantern to eternal imprisonment to save the universe. This will be recorded. This will be remembered. And we will bear the weight of that decision for as long as the core exists." "The alternative was extinction," another Guardian replied. "Yes, but that does not make this easy. It was never supposed to be easy. That is why we are Guardians." At the Rock of Eternity, Dr. Fate lowered his hands. The anchor was destroyed, its components scattered across dimensional space, but the seal itself remained, woven into the fabric of reality at a level so fundamental that even destroying the rock wouldn't break it. Zatanna approached him. "The Council will demand answers." "Let them demand." Fate's voice carried exhaustion. "I acted to preserve existence. If they wish to censure me for that, they may do so. But existence will still be here to witness the censure. Was it worth it? Ask the trillions who still live. Ask the worlds that continue spinning. Ask the parents who will wake beside their children tomorrow." Fate turned toward her. "But do not ask me. Because I helped seal a man in darkness, and I will carry that choice regardless of mathematics or necessity." Batman remained at the watchtower monitoring the seal, looking for any sign of weakness, any indication that the entity was trying to break through. The readings were stable. The dimensional barrier showed no stress. The prison was holding. Clark materialized beside him, silent for a long moment. "He's really gone," Clark said finally. "Yes." "And Wally. They're both in there." "Yes." "With that thing." "Yes." Batman finally looked away from the monitors. The Speed Force exists outside normal time. Seconds there might be years here, or vice versa. We have no way to know what they're experiencing, if they're experiencing anything at all. That's not comforting, Bruce. It wasn't meant to be. Comfort doesn't change reality. No. Clark looked at the empty space where the breach had been, where Barry had vanished into a dimension that was now sealed forever. But sometimes reality needs changing. Don't. Batman's voice was sharp. Don't even think it. Barry made us promise. We leave that seal intact. I know what I promised. Then keep your promise. Because if you break it, if you try to rescue him, and that thing gets out again, Barry's sacrifice means nothing. Clark said nothing. Because Bruce was right. Because they'd made a promise to a man who'd given everything. Because sometimes being a hero meant watching someone die and doing nothing to stop it. The watchtower's sensors showed empty space where the entity had been. The dead zones had stopped spreading. 40 sectors remained silent graveyards of civilizations that had existed for millennia. But the death had stopped. The spreading chaos had been contained. 3% chance of success. They'd beaten the odds. The cost had been everything Barry Allen was everything Wally West might have been. 2 lives exchanged for trillions. The math worked. The logic was sound. But logic didn't make it hurt less. Diana joined them in the watchtower. Then Hal. Then other League members summoned by news that the crisis was over. They gathered in silence, looking at the monitors at the empty space where their friends had been. We won, Hal said. Not celebration, just statement of fact. We survived, Diana corrected. That's not the same as winning. No, Superman agreed. It's not. They stood together. Heroes who'd saved everything by losing 2 of their own. Heroes who would carry that weight for the rest of their lives, however long those lives lasted. Batman pulled up a final report. Casualty estimates, resource depletion, sectors requiring decades of rebuilding. The damage was incalculable. The recovery would take generations. But there would be recovery. There would be generations. Life would continue. We need to establish relief efforts, Batman said. The affected sectors require food, medical supplies, temporary habitation. The logistics are, Bruce, Clark said quietly. Batman stopped. We just sealed away 2 of our friends. Can we have a moment before we move on to logistics? For a long moment, Batman said nothing. Then he nodded. Close the report. They stood together in silence, mourning the absent, feeling the weight of survival, knowing that tomorrow they would have to continue, would have to rebuild, protect to carry on the work of heroes, but giving themselves this moment to simply hurt. Outside the watchtower, the universe continued. Stars burned. Planets orbited. Life persisted in all its infinite variety. Trillions of beings who would never know how close they'd come to ending. How much had been paid to keep them alive. And somewhere beyond the dimensional barrier, in a place that was and wasn't that existed. In the spaces between motion and stillness, Barry Allen ran through infinite corridors of speed. Behind him, ahead of him, around him, the entity pursued. Or didn't pursue. The concepts became meaningless here, where speed was everything, and everything was speed. And deeper in those corridors, in a place that might have been distance or time, or neither, Wally West existed in a state that wasn't quite existence. Waiting. Though for what he could no longer remember. The seal held. The trap was complete. And the universe, wounded but alive, began the slow process of healing. Inside the Speed Force, time had no meaning. Barry ran because running was what he did, what he'd always done. But here in this place of infinite velocity, running and standing still were the same thing. He moved through corridors of lightning, through spaces that were moments and eternities simultaneously, and the concept of progress became irrelevant. Behind him, or ahead, or beside the geometry, was wrong here the entity pursued. Or didn't pursue. It simply existed in other positions along paths that had no clear direction. Sometimes close enough that Barry felt the wrongness radiating from it. Sometimes so distant, it might have been in another dimension entirely. Except they were already in another dimension. The speed force pulsed around them. Not welcoming exactly. More like a body trying to process a foreign object. The entity disrupted the currents, created dead spaces in pure motion. And wherever those dead spaces formed, the speed force felt sick. Barry could sense it. The corruption spreading, not fast. Nothing happened fast here despite speed being the only principle that mattered. But spreading nonetheless. The entity was doing what it did existing in places, making those places wrong. And the speed force, for all its infinite nature, was still a place. He'd been running for what felt like hours, or days, or seconds. The distinction had dissolved almost immediately upon entering. All he knew was that he was here, and he needed to keep the entity occupied. Keep it from finding the edges of this space, if edges even existed. And he needed to find Wally. The thought surfaced through the timeless haze. Wally was here. Somewhere. Inside the entity, or beyond it, or scattered across the speed force's infinite currents. Barry had promised Hal he'd try. Had promised himself. He altered his path. Not following any map. There were no maps here, but following intuition. Following the faint echo of another speedster's presence, a signature he'd known for years, trained beside trusted. The entity noticed the change. Shifted position. Appeared in what might have been his path, if paths were linear. Barry phased through it. The sensation was like passing through antimatter, a collision of opposing principles that shouldn't occupy the same space. His molecules screamed. The speed force stuttered around him. But he emerged on the other side, still running, still searching. And then he felt it. Not a presence exactly. More like an absence, shaped like a person. A void in the current that had familiar edges. Wally. Barry pushed harder. Reached for that void with everything he had, with power drawn from the speed force itself, with determination that transcended physics. The entity appeared between them, not blocking, just existing. Its form more defined here than it had been in normal space. Here, where speed was everything, the entity looked almost solid, almost real. Its blank face turned toward Barry with that same empty regard. And Barry understood something. The entity wasn't malicious, wasn't evil or cruel or even conscious in any way he could comprehend. It was simply incompatible. A thing from a place where different rules applied, thrust into spaces governed by principles it couldn't acknowledge. Understanding didn't make it less dangerous. Barry ran around it, through it, past it. Felt the wrongness each time they intersected. Felt pieces of himself trying to unmake, to lose coherence, to become less. But he held together. Because he was the Flash. Because he'd done the impossible before. Because Wally was here and needed him. The void grew closer, became more defined. And finally, Barry saw him. Wally floated in a space that wasn't quite a space. His form was there, but not there present, but scattered across multiple positions simultaneously. His eyes were open but unseeing, conscious but not aware. Wally, Barry's voice echoed strangely here. Kid, can you hear me? No response. But something flickered in Wally's expression. a ghost of recognition there and gone before Barry could be certain he'd seen it. Barry reached out, grabbed Wally's arm, or tried to. His hand passed through as if Wally existed in a different frequency. As if the absorption had left him out of phase with everything even here in the Speed Force, where phase should have been meaningless. "Come on," Barry said. "I know you're in there. I know you can feel this. The Speed Force. Home. You've been here before. You know the way back to yourself." Another flicker. Stronger this time. Wally's eyes, focused for half a second, saw Barry registered something that might have been hope or confusion, or both. Then the entity was there. It appeared in the space between them. Not attacking, just existing. And where it existed, the connection Barry was trying to forge with Wally dissolved. Barry pulled back, reassessed. The entity wasn't actively preventing the rescue. It simply was, and its presence made rescue impossible. Like trying to build a bridge across a chasm while someone stood in the middle of the span. He could run, could lead it away again, create distance, try to reach Wally from another angle. But the Speed Force was infinite. Distance meant nothing. He could run forever and never gain ground. The entity tilted its head. That too smooth motion that suggested joints weren't really joints here. And Barry realized something else. It was learning. Not in the way humans learned. Not through experience or adaptation. But through existence in this space, through exposure to the Speed Force's principles, it was becoming more synchronized with speed itself. Moving more efficiently. Appearing in more relevant positions. Give it enough time, whatever time meant here, and it would master this dimension the way it had begun mastering normal space after absorbing Wally. They couldn't stay here forever, but they couldn't leave either. Barry ran again. Not away, not toward anything. Just ran because running gave him time to think, and thinking was all he had left. Outside the Speed Force, in the universe that continued without its missing speedsters, 3 days had passed. 3 days of relief efforts, of evacuating survivors from dying worlds, of establishing supply lines to sectors that had lost everything, of counting the dead when counting became possible. The numbers were staggering. Civilizations older than human language had been erased. Species that had survived extinction events and cosmic disasters had simply ceased to exist. The cultural loss alone was incalculable art, philosophy, science, the accumulated wisdom of billions of years gone. But life continued. That was the terrible, beautiful truth. Life continued because Barry Allen had run into darkness. Superman stood at the memorial. They'd built it in Earth's orbit, a simple structure of crystal and light. No statues. Barry wouldn't have wanted statues, just a marker, a place to remember. The plaque was equally simple. Barry Allen, the Flash. He ran so others could live. Clark had written it himself. Refused all the elaborate suggestions, the heroic language, the attempts to mythologize. Barry had been a man, a good man who'd made an impossible choice. That deserved to be remembered simply. Diana joined him floating in the vacuum. The Council of Eternity has rendered their judgment. And Dr. Fate is censured, forbidden from using the rock's power without unanimous consent for the next millennium. That's all. They acknowledged the necessity. But necessity doesn't erase the breach of protocol. Diana looked at the memorial. He saved existence, and he's being punished for it. He knew the cost when he acted. That doesn't make it just. No. Superman turned away from the memorial. But justice and necessity aren't always the same thing. They'd all learned that lesson, were still learning it. At OA, the Guardians compiled their records. The event would be known as the Bleed Breach Crisis. The entity would be classified as unknown threat level Omega, contained but not destroyed, sealed but not neutralized. And in their most secure archives, accessible only to the Guardians themselves, they recorded the truth, that the seal was permanent, that Barry Allen and Wally West were trapped beyond rescue, that the entity remained active in its prison, potentially growing stronger, potentially finding ways to affect reality even from containment. The Green Lantern Corps would monitor the seal forever, would watch for any sign of weakness, any indication that the barrier was failing. It would become part of their eternal duty, passed from generation to generation of lanterns. A vigil with no end. Batman worked alone in the watchtower, as he often did. But his work had changed focus. No longer tracking the entity's movements, those had stopped when the seal formed. Now, he tracked the seal itself. The readings were disturbing. The dimensional barrier was holding perfectly. No stress, no degradation, no sign of failure. But there was something else. A resonance. A frequency that shouldn't exist. The speed force was changing. Subtle variations in tachyon emissions. Microscopic fluctuations in temporal readings. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that indicated immediate danger. But enough to suggest that having the entity locked inside was affecting the speed force itself. "You're seeing it too." Batman didn't turn. He'd heard Clark approach. "Yes." "What does it mean?" "I don't know yet. The speed force exists partially outside our ability to measure. These readings could mean nothing. Or they could mean the entity is corrupting it. Slowly. Over decades or centuries. And if it is, then eventually the speed force becomes uninhabitable. Toxic. And any speedster who tries to access it." Batman finally looked at Superman. "We may have saved the universe by destroying the one thing that made speedsters possible. There are other speedsters. Jay Garrick, Bart Allen, Jesse Quick. If the speed force becomes dangerous, then we lose them too, one by one, as they're forced to choose between giving up their powers or risking corruption." Superman had no response, because Bruce was right. Because they'd made a choice based on incomplete information and pure desperation. And now they'd live with the consequences, whatever those consequences turned out to be. "Do we tell them?" Superman asked. "Not yet. Not until I'm certain. No point in causing panic over a hypothesis." "Bruce." "I said not yet, Clark." They stood in silence, watching the monitors, watching a seal that held perfectly, while hiding a slow poison behind it. Elsewhere in the galaxy, speedsters went about their work. Running, saving, protecting. And none of them noticed the change. The subtle wrongness creeping into their connection to the speed force. Not yet. But they would. In a research station orbiting a neutron star, a young speedster named Jessie Quick pushed herself to top velocity, responding to an emergency beacon. She reached the crisis point in seconds, evacuated the endangered personnel, neutralized the threat. Standard work for someone with her abilities. But when she stopped running, when she pulled back from the speed force's currents, she felt something. A moment of disorientation, a sensation like touching something slick and wrong. It passed quickly. Probably nothing. Stress from the mission, fatigue catching up. She filed a brief report log. The rescue moved on to the next emergency, and didn't notice the faint darkness at the edge of her perception when she accessed her powers. Didn't see the shadow that hadn't been there before. Not yet. Inside the Speed Force, Barry had stopped trying to reach Wally. Not given up, but recognized futility when he saw it. The entity's presence made rescue impossible. And even if he could somehow extract Wally, where would they go? The seal was permanent. The way out was closed. They were here forever. Barry found a space or created one. The distinction was unclear where the currents flowed relatively clean. Where the entity's corruption hadn't spread yet, he settled there if settling was possible in a place with no ground. The entity drifted past, appeared nearby, vanished, returned. Its pattern was becoming more comprehensible, more predictable, as if existing here was teaching it the rules Barry understood instinctively. Eventually, it would understand them completely. Eventually, it might find a way to affect the seal from inside. Barry pushed the thought away, focused on what he could control, which wasn't much. Couldn't leave, couldn't rescue Wally, couldn't stop the entity from learning. But he could run, could stay between the entity and Wally's scattered form, could make himself the more interesting target, the brighter object, the thing worth following. For years, decades, centuries, however long it took, he'd made a promise to Superman, made them all promise to leave the seal intact. And he'd keep his end of that bargain. Would stay here in this place that was speed and nothing else, and make sure the entity never found a way out. Even if the cost was everything he was, even if the price was eternity. Barry Allen started running again. Not toward anything, not away from anything. Just running because that's what he did, what he'd always done, what he would do forever. And in the spaces between his steps, Wally West existed in a state that wasn't quite existence. Waiting, though for what he could no longer remember. The Speed Force flowed around them all, changed slowly by the presence of something that shouldn't be there, became less than it was, began the long process of corruption that would take centuries to complete. And at the edge of everything, barely perceptible even to instruments designed to measure the impossible, a speedster pushed herself to maximum velocity and felt something wrong in the currents she drew from. Felt it and dismissed it, not knowing she'd just touched the scar. The universe continued. Stars burned, planets orbited, life persisted. Trillions of beings who owed their existence to two men they'd never heard of. Two speedsters who'd traded everything for a tomorrow they'd never see. The seal held. The trap was permanent. And in the watchtower, Batman continued his vigil. Watching, measuring, calculating, preparing for the day when the scar would open again. Because scars never truly healed, they just waited.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss out future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.